Chapter 5. The Mission. Did I have sufficient regard for the U.S. military's mission in West Germany? I probably gave it as much consideration as the average GI. This would not have been enough in the eyes of the brass. GIs understood that when the Soviets attacked, 7 divisions, or some other large-sounding number, of Warsaw Pact armor would reach the Rhine in 5 days. This was against the stiffest resistance NATO could muster. It didn't matter how many reforger exercises tore up Germany's precious pastures, nor the number of tanken sessions on the plains of Wildfecken and Grafenwehr. Nor was this consensus allayed by open talk at the highest political and command levels of burying ADMs, that is, atomic demolition mines, in the Fulda Gap, from whence the tanks of the East Bloc would come rumbling. To the contrary, detonating fissionable material seemed simply another way of vainly sacrificing 200,000 military personnel. Inside U.S. barracks, posters with color illustrations of Soviet diplomatic license plates warned soldiers in bold letters to report all sightings near U.S. military installations. GIs got a good laugh out of the enemy announcing its presence in this manner. Passing through train depots in Frankfurt and Stuttgart, anybody with 20/20 eyesight could spot the intelligence agents from east and west, trying not to be observed. GIs knew this cat and mouse had been taking place unchanged for more than 25 years. Farce was palpable. Analysts today ponder the significance of the 1950s decision to authorize and underwrite accompanied tours in West Germany for U.S. personnel. To the historians, the policy shift marks the transition from occupying army to German ally. But did its importance rest in demonstrating that U.S. forces were going to remain for the long haul, or in showing that not only was America willing to sacrifice its military, but their families too? Despite the official Freundschaften clubs promoting contact between Germans and Americans, interaction remained relatively minuscule. Soldiers spent 2 or 3 year tour in Heidelberg region and almost never exceeded the boundaries of Mark Twain and Patrick Henry villages. Black GIs friendly with Fräuleins and GIs purchasing hash on Untere Neckarstraße were exceptions. The Army provided everything familiar to U.S. residents, from hamburger joints to bowling alleys. Broad, well-paved avenues intersected like Main Street, USA. Handy white steepled chapels of the major religious denominations served their congregants' spiritual needs. All the recognizable packaged foods and cosmetics brands lined the commissary shelves. Armed Forces Network broadcast 24 hours of news plus music appealing to every stateside taste, C&W to soul. Without examining the merits of the mission, it might be possible to summon some compassion for individual commanders who found themselves in difficult, if not impassable, straits. In 1970, Nixon's Defense Secretary, Melvin Laird, inaugurated VOLAR and the all-volunteer Army. Although the draft did not disappear from the statute books until U.S. combat in Vietnam ceased in January 1973, conscription as a reality in young men's lives evaporated a couple of years before. The ranks were filled successfully through voluntary enlistments. The Army achieved this by portraying itself as a place resembling the real world. As one career officer assigned to Heidelberg headquarters boasted, "We brightened up the mess halls, put colored formica tables in, and stuff like that." This cut across the grain for commanders unprepared by tradition and disinclined in the wake of military disappointment in Vietnam to accept a slackening of discipline. The career-minded wanted to be known for a unit's readiness, not its capacity to embrace new, difficult-to-interpret directives. Haircut regulations, more in keeping with 1970 styles, are a good example. The Army distributed posters depicting acceptable haircuts for soldiers, black and white. But it wasn't specified whether the hair length shown represented the men before or after visiting the barber. Black GIs sought out willing Army physicians for profiles, allowing them to grow stubbly beards based on diagnoses of pseudofolliculitis, a skin condition caused by whiskers ingrown from shaving. Commanders were frustrated. Constant friction and hassling with the men resulted. At the end of 1972, Bob Rivkin and I began receiving a stream of reports from Army units across West Germany and Berlin, revealing attempts to reverse the liberalization ballyhooed under Volar. The usual rationale was drug suppression, and a colorful local name like Operation Full Court Press typically reflected the zeal of implementation. Under the guise of no more than suspected contact with drugs, new regulations authorized lower echelon commanders to deprive soldiers of civilian clothes, licenses to drive their own vehicles, personal decorations in their quarters, even the doors to their rooms. Some commanders massed their troops for 6 a.m. inspections, making them strip and ordering the men to submit to searches of their belongings, including wallets. An especially galling defect of the campaign to our client's way of thinking was a complete absence of comparable measures leveled against the notorious juicers in their units. At the least, Bob wanted to expose these abuses. At most, he hoped to see them overturned in the United States Federal District Court. We began collecting affidavits, setting out the worst examples. These, combined with the regulations and directives themselves, would form the backbone of an action seeking to enjoin the Army's new program, temporarily and permanently. Our petitioner was the Committee for GI Rights, an echo from the title of Rivkin's book, which would represent the members' interests in a class action. The committee existed primarily on paper, but this is not uncommon in such lawsuits. Because the case needed to be filed in the U.S., we asked Addlestone to line up some D.C. lawyers, and Bob got himself a ticket for the States. On the day of filing, he phoned to let me know we had the good fortune of drawing Judge Gerhard Gesell, famous as the trial judge in Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers case. During the same month, a young Chicano from Mannheim, Turley Barracks, came into LMDC, seeking advice. He had taped a poster above his bunk that his captain was ordering him to take down. "What's the poster?" I asked. Private E2 Raymond Olais, from the small California town of Orosi near Fresno, described a 2 by 3 foot picture of Che Guevara wearing his familiar beret. Beneath the image appeared the motto, "Hasta la victoria siempre," which might be translated, "Victory will be ours." I got the feeling that what Raymond lacked in size, he possessed in steadfastness. It's tough giving advice on the legality of an order. The risks the risk rests on the person who refuses to follow a disputed command. None on the lawyer. Has anyone complained to you about the poster? Any men in your unit said to you they didn't like it? Raymond said no. Other soldiers had rock posters of groups like Steppenwolf, Cream, and King Crimson. This was the only one he thought might be political. What's likely to happen if I refuse? Asked Private Elias. I had to tell him that an order refusal couldn't be ignored by the commander. Who's your CO? It's a new captain named Kleiman. I think the first sergeant is putting pressure on him to have me take it down. There. It's always the lifer sergeant who gets a bug up his ass. They might want to give you non-judicial punishment, or maybe they'll take it to a court-martial, I counseled. It's up to the CO. If they offer you an NJP, you have the option of accepting it, or if you refuse, then the CO can refer the matter to a special court-martial. If you accept the NJP, then the punishment you can get is limited. You can't be put in the stockade, but you can be restricted. Another big difference is that with NJP, you don't have a lawyer. Basically, your CO is judge, jury, and executioner. But at a special court, you have the right to a lawyer and a right to a full trial. The trouble is that if you're found guilty, then you can get up to 6 months in the stockade. I had set out these options previously to hundreds of GIs. I hated the box it put them in. Seldom did a man want to risk confinement at the cost of vindicating his rights. Military justice makes a soldier who bucks his CO pay dearly. Elias listened quietly. He didn't say what his intentions were as he departed, but I sensed he might be different. 2 weeks later, Elias returned to tell me he'd refused the order, and he was now being extended a company grade NJP. This meant he could be reduced in rank, 1 pay grade, and restricted to the company area for 30 days. Elias said he wanted to refuse the NJP and have his day in court. He understood this meant he could end up in the stockade. The JAG Defense Council at Turley had laid out the federal conviction line on him. The phrase works like holy terror on a GI when a military lawyer wants to avoid adding another case to his trial docket. The word federal makes the soldier imagine no employer will ever give him a job. If the military lawyer had said Elias risked a misdemeanor conviction, which is more accurate, then the effect wouldn't be so overpowering. The JAG's tactics hadn't altered Elias' determination, however. I told Raymond Elias that I thought Captain Kleiman's order was an abridgment of his constitutional right to free speech, and therefore unlawful. I would be at his side if the command opted to take the case to trial. For weeks I'd been receiving letters from a group of Americans in a German prison in the town of Butzbach. I dubbed them the Butzbach Boys. With the permission of their jailers, they printed a monthly newspaper, The Bridge. Now their German counselor asked me whether I would schedule a visit to the Gefängnis north of Frankfurt. I wasn't at all sure I could justify the time for a trip to Butzbach. It meant an entire day shot. I say this because there was absolutely nothing I could do for my correspondents. They'd each been convicted for a German offense, normally drug dealing. If they were in the service, the military had long ago discharged them undesirably. Some of them weren't even Americans, just other English speakers, Nigerians, Pakistanis, Canadians. linking up so they could contribute to the bridge. They persuaded me with their earnestness. The prison looked like a fortress with some turrets and narrow slit windows, where I envisioned archers standing. I met my letter writers and the counselor in the day room. Most of them were serving sentences in the range of 4 to 5 years. I brought some issues of Fight Back and Forward, and we discussed the finer points of alternative publishing. The young German counselor looked pleased to have connected his charges with someone better able to meet them halfway. One ex-GI asked me whether I wanted to visit his cell. Surprised that this was possible, I agreed. The day room may have had a modern chrome and plastic feel, but there was no concealing the musty history of my guide's cramped quarters. In the name of medium security, he enjoyed an open-door policy. He invited me in without need of a key-turning guard. A shelf for books and personal photographs were the inmates' indicia of possession. In the corner stood a porcelain commode built into the wall like it was part of the foundation. I didn't linger. Back in the day room, I said goodbye. I had been inside the walls of Butzbach for 2.5 hours. In the fall of 1977, back in the U.S. once more, I learned of the coordinated prison suicides of the core members of the Rote Armee Fraktion. In my distant mind's eye, these men and women died in cells identical to the Butzbach boys. Rifkin returned from Washington to report that the argument in front of Judge Gesell went favorably. He was optimistic about receiving the injunctive relief we hoped would shut down the Army's campaign against its enlisted personnel. The judge exhibited a keen interest in the extreme measures the Army said it deemed critical to dealing with drug abuse. Weren't there less onerous means available to ensure health and safety to the troops? Gesell wanted to know. The assistant U.S. attorney ignored the judge's query, replying the steps were purely matters of military discretion. The judge took the case under advisement. We could expect a decision in the next couple of months. In the meantime, Judge Gesell suggested the Army should consider easing some of the program's more extreme features. One of Volar's explicit reforms was greater sensitivity to the needs of minority service personnel. Equal opportunity representatives, civilian employees of the Department of Army, fielded complaints, raised issues of fairness in promotion, and served as outlets of racial awareness. PFC Larry Johnson arrived at Merzgasse 7 in April 1973, accompanied by an equal opportunity rep. Before his transfer to Kaiserslautern, Larry had been a personnel clerk assigned to Strasbourg Kaserne at Eider Oberstein, north of Baumholder. Together, Larry and the rep laid out the situation. 3 months before, Johnson had spotted an article in Jet magazine describing the anti-colonial war in Mozambique, led by Frelimo against the Portuguese. A grisly photograph of 5 Portuguese mercenaries posed with the decapitated black heads of 3 Frelimo guerrillas illustrated the text. The article also mentioned that Portugal was a NATO member, and thus it might be assumed that U.S.-supplied weapons were in use against the anti-colonial forces. Larry took the magazine to his captain commanding his unit and asked about the accuracy of the report. The captain conceded it probably was true, but suggested that Larry look into the question more deeply. At the base library, Larry satisfied himself that the U.S. was supporting Portugal. Armed with this information, Johnson went back to the CO. The captain agreed with Larry's conclusion and suggested he write his congressman. Larry believed he was being aufgeplayed in the GI's homespun German. So he replied he would do this if you'll write too. The captain demurred. It's impossible for me. I intend to make the Army my career. Just what I was afraid of, Larry said to me. What could he do now? Nothing immediately came to me. Nothing that would please Larry particularly. Write an article for Fight Back? That didn't seem to fit Larry's style. Johnson was slight, but solidly built. I never saw him without his Brando Wild One sunglasses. He could be forceful. More than once, I heard him say to a passerby, "Hey, bro, let me hold $10 till next week." He always got it. The color of Larry's skin was like the surface of strong coffee. He told me he had been drafted out of Harlem, and then I agreed to a 3-year hitch promising me Germany. I have my grandma back home and my brother. He's been messed up since he fell or jumped out of the 5th floor, fucked up on heroin. He lived? Yeah, but his head's not right. It's always mumbling shit. Where this was going, I wasn't sure. The Equal Opportunity rep had read about LMDC and figured Larry could profit from our advice. I thought of suggesting an ingenious use of Article 138, but Larry's CO hadn't wronged him in any way to complain about. Johnson was not content to let the matter lie. That was obvious. I had told him to keep in close touch with the rep and to let me know if he needed to confer about anything. Our next communication was the news that Johnson had, quote-unquote, resigned. He'd failed to report to work. He'd refused orders to muster in the morning. He was no longer saluting, and wearing the uniform was not something the CO could count on. In a move taken from a Soviet instruction manual, the command ordered Larry examined by a team of psychiatrists at Landstuhl Military Hospital. Predictably, the shrinks found nothing wrong mentally, but offered the view that Larry, quote, has a problem with authority, close quote. The doctor's report failed to mention Mozambique. Probably feeling he had no alternative, the commander transferred Larry to Kaiserslautern and referred 6 specifications to court-martial charges alleging disobedience of orders and failure to report. Johnson couldn't be charged with absence without leave since he'd never left the base. If Larry was looking to be released from the Army early, he seemed to have the answer in the palm of his hand. But no, he wanted a trial, one where he would plead not guilty and be heard regarding Portugal and its East African colony. That was an ambitious undertaking, I told him by telephone. I had described the unfolding case to Max. Did he have any ideas? Yes, he knew of a Portuguese teaching at the university who had left his country to avoid fighting in Africa. We went to see this graduate student in his apartment across the Neckar. He knew the situation in Mozambique well, he said. The fighting was getting worse. The colonial authorities were engaging in terror, massacring entire villages that supported Frelimo. He told us that the Order of White Fathers, called this because of their robes, missionaries who had served the native Mozambicans for generations, had been expelled by the government a few months back for protesting the slaughter. Supposedly, one of their members was now in Rome, directed by the Pope to author a comprehensive report. I liked the sound of this. Could we get in touch with this priest? In a week, Max phoned to say he had spoken to Father Cesare Bertulli. He would travel from Rome if we thought he could help our client. If we applied for Army travel funds, we would tip off the prosecution about the priest's testimony. We would have to find the money ourselves. I put the wheels in motion. In the midst of maneuvering on behalf of Johnson, Raymond Olias' case was coming to a head. As anticipated, the command referred Ray's refusal of an order to remove the Che poster to a special court-martial. The trial raised classic First Amendment questions, but in a military setting. The test was whether the prosecutor could show a military necessity for the order. The expected method would be to justify it in the name of morale and discipline. Because the facts involved a confrontation between Olias and his immediate commander, I urged my client to waive his right to a trial before military members. He agreed to have the case decided by the military judge. This turned out to be Major Herbert Green, awarded the name Mean Judge Green by defense counsel in the region. I asked myself whether his family name had once been Greenberg. Having a notoriously harsh judge wasn't something I relished, but we had no alternative. Perhaps he'd feel flattered in a high-profile free speech case that we'd willingly accept him over a military jury. Because of his reputation for civil liberties cases, I asked Rivkin to second chair the defense. Captain Kleiman has already demonstrated by his failure to steer the conflict toward a resolution outside of court, proved to be a rather wooden witness. To boxing trainers, the technique is known as squaring the ring. Each time an opponent moves laterally to avoid your dominant glove, you take a short step in the same direction, forcing him to either repeat the side step or face you head on. 9 out of 10 times, an adversary renews the lateral movement and is soon concerned only with backpedaling and escape, which to the crowd's pleasure becomes increasingly unmanageable. I began cross-examination by asking the captain, were there posters in the men's living area besides the picture of Che Guevara? Yes, but they aren't controversial, he replied. What would make a poster controversial? Well, complaints from other soldiers. What other posters have you seen, for example? Large posters of guitarists like Jimi Hendrix and Keith Richards. And did you have any complaints about these rock and roll posters? No, I got no complaints regarding the rock stars. They're not political. Is something political if it generates complaints? Yes, that's possible. Would a poster of a religious figure be political if it generated complaints? Yes, I would think so. For instance, if someone had a poster of Gandhi and it caused a complaint, would you feel compelled to order it removed? Why, of course. And if the poster was of Martin Luther King, would your answer be the same? Probably. And if the image was that of Jesus Christ, would your concern for discipline and morale cause you to order it removed? Judge Green interrupted. Counsel, I believe I see your point. I replied, then I don't need to question the captain any longer. The risk for Judge Green, I decided, was that a witness was going to endorse stripping the Son of God from the walls of the U.S. Army. At the prosecution's conclusion, I asked the judge for a finding of not guilty. My argument was that Kleiman's unjustified order was clearly unconstitutional as a matter of law. Major Green denied the motion. He was unwilling to declare an officer's order facially illegal. We'd have to put on a defense. I asked Private Olias to take the witness stand. Raymond again began by describing his background in California's San Joaquin Valley, where right then Cesar Chavez was organizing the United Farm Workers. His family had been agricultural laborers for generations. Raymond rounded his vowels with soft eloquence. My grandfather is from Mexico. He came to California in 1911 looking for work in the fields to the north after fighting with Emiliano Zapata. Che Guevara is in the same tradition as the man my abuelo fought alongside of. Perfect. Here was a dream witness, helping intelligently with his self-command and utter candor. Raymond confirmed to the prosecutor that there were no complaints about his poster addressed either to him or the command. He thought for a moment before answering fully, however. But somebody made a comment. Raymond paused again. A guy looked at the poster and said, "Right on." Elias lifted his fist to demonstrate the GI's punctuation. Trial counsel wanted no more of Private Raymond Elias, nor did Judge Green, who ruled from the bench that the accused was not guilty. Solely upon the facts of this case, I find the order lacked sufficient basis to justify it in terms of discipline and morale. Green muddled the ruling legally and took care not to offer us any precedent, but a win is a win. The next issue of Fight Back printed an extraordinary drawing by Elias. A cartoon depicts the first barracks inspection following the acquittal as Judge Kleiman and the first sergeant, both visibly recognizable, discover Che's face, once again peering eerily at them from above Elias's bunk. Raymond told me that GIs started coming by to be photographed alongside the famous poster. Father Bertulli reached Heidelberg a day before the beginning of Larry Johnson's trial. Commencement of proceedings had itself become an issue. A week earlier, Larry came to Heidelberg to meet with me and take part in a fight-back gathering. On hand was a black ex-GI from Detroit, Darnell Summers. One of the burdens of defending political cases is that they cease to be the domain of the lawyer and client. They become public property. It was my task this weekend to make clear to Larry that he could expect no outcome other than guilty as charged. We'll do our best to make your protest central to the trial, but we have no real defense to the charges. Summers didn't like this. Counsel, sounds to me like you're not ready for trial. I assured him I was, and that in any event, our court date was set and couldn't be changed. Sure it can. Just tell him you're sick. Here was somebody out of the blue urging me to deceive the court. I fought to look unperturbed. The idea flashed that we had a provocateur sitting in. I worried what effect Summers' suggestion would have on Larry. I needn't have. He declared himself prepared. I would never have a better client. I took advantage of the time with Father Bertulli by introducing Larry to the missionary priest. We gathered at Mittler Geisbergweg for an evening meal. Communication proved complicated. Bertulli spoke several languages, none of them English. Among my Spanish, Bertulli's Portuguese, French and Italian, and the French spoken by Janelle, Max, and June, we jury-rigged a four-tongued conversation between our guest and the protester. Bertulli carried a folder of black and white photographs, scenes of atrocities in the Mozambican village of Wiriyamu. He had personally investigated the types of weapons in the hands of the Portuguese military. Naturally, they included the familiar designs and manufacture out of NATO's arsenal. I wanted somehow to have Father Bertulli testify as corroboration, bolstering Johnson's symbolic action. So we spent several hours examining the photos and listening to Bertulli's accounts of villages burned to the ground, residents maimed and scattered, children starving, and brutal killings of non-combatants. He verified everything that had moved Larry to act. The first trial day was a carnival. We had Judge Green again. He wanted me to elect who would be the spectators for the defense. I said we should find a larger courtroom, refusing to concede the legitimacy of a tribunal unable to accommodate more than 10 persons, including 2 men obviously sent by Army intelligence. The judge's refusal meant several of the Fight Back supporters spent most of the trial in the hallway. Larry also had a surprise for me. He insisted on wearing civilian clothing. Not only had he arrived at court sporting a blue denim work shirt, but on the back he had rudely embroidered, "I ain't your nigger." Surely, I thought, before the members of the military jury saw Larry in this getup, Judge Green would rescue Larry from himself. Green, as he had shown, exercised the power to control his courtroom. It could be reversible error to permit Larry to come before the members in a manner so prejudicial to his own chances. My thinking overlooked the judge's meanness. After failing to get me to change Johnson's mind, Judge Green decided to allow Larry to appear out of uniform, quote, so long as the accused desire to do so is clearly stated on the record. The prosecution's evidence consisted of matter-of-fact recitation of Johnson's failure to report, salute when ordered to do so, and so forth, with no reference to his motivation whatsoever. I asked only a few questions of the prosecution witnesses. Larry was the first witness for the defense. Over trial counsel's objections, Judge Green permitted PFC Johnson to explain the basis for his unilateral resignation from the Army, including his frustrated efforts to protest the U.S. role in Mozambique through authorized channels. But that was the judge's limit. When we called Father Bertulli, the prosecutor jumped to his feet requesting a hearing out of the presence of the military jury. Judge Green demanded that the defense provide an offer of proof regarding Father Bertulli's expected testimony and, quote, its relevance to this case. I explained that Father Bertulli would give first-hand expert testimony corroborating the basis for Johnson's action, including a description of NATO weapons. Without hearing from the priest, Judge Green ruled this testimony was irrelevant to the charges, quote, because the accused had no contact with the witness prior to the alleged violations. He had allowed Johnson to explain his motivation. That was as far as he was willing to go. This sucked the air out of our case and left Larry flat. He was just some scamming GI looking to avoid work. I could already hear trial counsel's closing argument. 2 minutes after Judge Green denied me his testimony, I called my next witness, Father Cesare Bertulli. "You better not be messing with me, counsel," Judge Green muttered. "Your Honor," I turned toward the military jury, "we call Father Bertulli as a character witness, as the spiritual advisor to the accused." I was taking advantage of the liberal rules regarding evidence of character in military courts. I wanted Bertulli to address the jury as part of the case on the merits, and not merely as a mitigation witness when we reached sentencing. The court swore June Leibowitz as our French to English translator. He knew about the atrocities he'd been investigating. Nevertheless, he described his background working with the poor in Mozambique and rendered a favorable opinion of Larry's character based on his conversations with him. The conversations, of course, covered the photographs we had examined in Heidelberg. Thus, we succeeded in getting some of the previously excluded evidence in front of the members. The military jury found Larry guilty on 5 out of 6 counts. Perhaps I should have been encouraged by the one acquittal, but I didn't give it a thought as we moved directly into the trial's penalty phase. I made the early biography of Lafayette the centerpiece of my sentencing presentation. A brazen move, but I decided Larry was worth the risk of comparing his bold, headstrong protest against the colonial regime to the great Frenchman's desertion from his country's military academy to join the American Revolution. The Encyclopedia Britannica at America House in Heidelberg, erstwhile scene of countless anti-CIA student demos, was my source for this historical nugget. Unlike any sentence I'd ever encountered, the court members urged that after 45 days confinement, Johnson receive a general discharge under honorable conditions. They were completely beyond their authority in making such a recommendation. Everyone interpreted the pronouncement as an affirmation of Larry's stand. When we returned to the office the next morning from Kaiserslautern, I found the doorway to Becker, Laubscher, and Becker daubed with red lettering. When the shit comes down, the shit will come over you. Based on the strained syntax and scatological phraseology, I suspected a German hand, probably Karen's boyfriend Gerhard, overstressed at not being brought into our dealings with Mike McDougal.